The following is a News Channel 8 special report.
Coverage in a special report from News Channel 8. President Obama will address the nation on his plan to combat Islamic State terrorists in Iraq and possibly Syria as well. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Morris Jones. We will have the president's remarks in full any moment now, and later analysis from our military expert, retired Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran, PhD, and author. Also, for political insight, Tim Starks is here from CQ Roll Call. I'll be talking to them right after the speech. Back to the White House now, where earlier today, excerpts from the president's speech were released to the media. The president writes the U.S. will lead a broad coalition to roll back the terrorist threat. His objective, destroy ISIS through a sustained counterterrorism strategy. The statement goes on to say, whatever operations are taken, they will not include American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. And this military action will differ from those of prior wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Instead, the president compared potential confrontations to those over the past several years in Yemen and Somalia. Earlier today, one of our allies, France, said it's ready to take part in airstrikes against Islamic State fighters in Iraq. The U.S. has launched numerous bombing campaigns against ISIS strongholds across Iraq and over the past few weeks. France specifically mentioned aiding the arming of Kurdish forces in the northwest part of the war-torn nation. The French president and foreign minister are going to Iraq this Friday. That would follow today's visit by Secretary of State John Kerry, who spent the day in Baghdad. Here now, the president.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak to you about what the United States will do with our friends and allies to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group known as ISIL. As Commander-in-Chief, my highest priority is the security of the American people. Over the last several years, we have consistently taken the fight to terrorists who threaten our country. We took out Osama bin Laden and much of al-Qaeda's leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've targeted al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen and recently eliminated the top commander of its affiliate in Somalia. We've done so while bringing more than 140,000 American troops home from Iraq and drawing down our forces in Afghanistan, where our combat mission will end later this year. Thanks to our military and counterterrorism professionals, America is safer. Still, we continue to face a terrorist threat. We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge. At this moment, the greatest threats come from the Middle East and North Africa, where radical groups exploit grievances for their own gain. And one of those groups is ISIL, which calls itself the Islamic State. Now let's make two things clear. ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. And ISIL is certainly not a state. It was formerly al-Qaeda's affiliate in Iraq and has taken advantage of sectarian strife and Syria's civil war to gain territory on both sides of the Iraq-Syrian border. It is recognized by no government, nor by the people it subjugates. ISIL is a terrorist organization, pure and simple, and it has no vision other than the slaughter of all who stand in its way. In a region that has known so much bloodshed, these terrorists are unique in their brutality. They execute captured prisoners. They kill children. They enslave, rape, and force women into marriage. They threatened a religious minority with genocide. And in acts of barbarism, they took the lives of two American journalists, Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff. So ISIL poses a threat to the people of Iraq and Syria and the broader Middle East, including American citizens, personnel, and facilities. If left unchecked, these terrorists could pose a growing threat beyond that region, including to the United States. While we have not yet detected specific plotting against our homeland, ISIL leaders have threatened America and our allies. Our intelligence community believes that thousands of foreigners, including Europeans and some Americans, have joined them in Syria and Iraq. Trained and battle-hardened, these fighters could try to return to their home countries and carry out deadly attacks. I know many Americans are concerned about these threats. Tonight, I want you to know that the United States of America is meeting them with strength and resolve. Last month, I ordered our military to take targeted action against ISIL to stop its advances. Since then, we've conducted more than 150 successful airstrikes in Iraq. These strikes have protected American personnel and facilities, killed ISIL fighters, destroyed weapons, and given space for Iraqi and Kurdish forces to reclaim key territory. These strikes have also helped save the lives of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. But this is not our fight alone. American power can make a decisive difference, but we cannot do for Iraqis what they must do for themselves. Nor can we take the place of Arab partners in securing their region. And that's why I've insisted that additional U.S. action depended upon Iraqis forming an inclusive government, which they have now done in recent days. So tonight, with a new Iraqi government in place, and following consultations with allies abroad and Congress at home, I can announce that America will lead a broad coalition to roll back this terrorist threat. Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense. Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven. Second, we will increase our support to forces fighting these terrorists on the ground. In June, I deployed several hundred American service members to Iraq to assess how we can best support Iraqi security forces. Now that those teams have completed their work and Iraq has formed a government, we will send an additional 475 service members to Iraq. As I've said before, these American forces will not have a combat mission. We will not get dragged into another ground war in Iraq, but they are needed to support Iraqi and Kurdish forces with training, intelligence, and equipment. We'll also support Iraq's efforts to stand up National Guard units to help Sunni communities secure their own freedom from ISIL's control. Across the border in Syria, we have ramped up our military assistance to the Syrian opposition. Tonight, I call on Congress again to give us additional authorities and resources to train and equip these fighters. In the fight against ISIL, we cannot rely on an Assad regime that terrorizes its own people, a regime that will never regain the legitimacy it has lost. Instead, we must strengthen the opposition as the best counterweight to extremists like ISIL, while pursuing the political solution necessary to solve Syria's crisis once and for all. Third, we will continue to draw on our substantial counterterrorism capabilities to prevent ISIL attacks. Working with our partners, we will redouble our efforts to cut off its funding, improve our intelligence, strengthen our defenses, counter its warped ideology, and stem the flow of foreign fighters into and out of the Middle East. And in 2 weeks, I will chair a meeting of the UN Security Council to further mobilize the international community around this effort. Fourth, we will continue to provide humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians who've been displaced by this terrorist organization. This includes Sunni and Shia Muslims who are at grave risk, as well as tens of thousands of Christians and other religious minorities. We cannot allow these communities to be driven from their ancient homelands. So this is our strategy. And in each of these 4 parts of our strategy, America will be joined by a broad coalition of partners. Already, allies are flying planes with us over Iraq, sending arms and assistance to Iraqi security forces and the Syrian opposition, sharing intelligence and providing billions of dollars in humanitarian aid. Secretary Kerry was in Iraq today, meeting with the new government and supporting their efforts to promote unity. And in the coming days, he will travel across the Middle East and Europe to enlist more partners in this fight, especially Arab nations who can help mobilize Sunni communities in Iraq and Syria to drive these terrorists from their lands. This is American leadership at its best. We stand with people who fight for their own freedom, and we rally other nations on behalf of our common security and common humanity. My administration has also secured bipartisan support for this approach here at home. I have the authority to address the threat from ISIL, but I believe we are strongest as a nation when the President and Congress work together. So I welcome congressional support for this effort in order to show the world that Americans are united in confronting this danger. Now, it will take time to eradicate a cancer like ISIL. And any time we take military action, there are risks involved, especially to the servicemen and women who carry out these missions. But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground. This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years, and it is consistent with the approach I outlined earlier this year, to use force against anyone who threatens America's core interests, but to mobilize partners wherever possible to address broader challenges to international order. My fellow Americans, we live in a time of great change. Tomorrow marks 13 years since our country was attacked. Next week marks 6 years since our economy suffered its worst setback since the Great Depression. Yet, despite these shocks, through the pain we felt and the grueling work required to bounce back, America is better positioned today to seize the future than any other nation on earth. Our technology companies and universities are unmatched. Our manufacturing and auto industries are thriving. Energy independence is closer than it's been in decades. For all the work that remains, our businesses are in the longest uninterrupted stretch of job creation in our history, despite all the divisions and discord within our democracy. I see the grit and determination and common goodness of the American people every single day, and that makes me more confident than ever about our country's future. A broad American leadership is the one constant in an uncertain world. It is America that has the capacity and the will to mobilize the world against terrorists. It is America that has rallied the world against Russian aggression and in support of the Ukrainian people's right to determine their own destiny. It is America, our scientists, our doctors, our know-how that can help contain and cure the outbreak of Ebola. It is America that helped remove and destroy Syria's declared chemical weapons so that they can't pose a threat to the Syrian people or the world again. And it is America that is helping Muslim communities around the world, not just in the fight against terrorism, but in the fight for opportunity and tolerance and a more hopeful future. America, our endless blessings bestow an enduring burden. But as Americans, we welcome our responsibility to lead. From Europe to Asia, from the far reaches of Africa to war-torn capitals of the Middle East, we stand for freedom, for justice, for dignity. These are values that have guided our nation since its founding. Tonight, I ask for your support in carrying that leadership forward. I do so as a commander-in-chief who could not be prouder of our men and women in uniform. Pilots who bravely fly in the face of danger above the Middle East, and service members who support our partners on the ground. When we helped prevent the massacre of civilians trapped on a distant mountain, here's what one of them said: "We owe our American friends our lives. Our children will always remember that there was someone who felt our struggle and made a long journey to protect innocent people. That is the difference we make in the world. And our own safety, our own security, depends upon our willingness to do what it takes to defend this nation and uphold the values that we stand for. Timeless ideals that will endure long after those who offer only hate and destruction have been vanquished from the earth. May God bless our troops, and may God bless the United States of America.
Live coverage here on News Channel 8. President Obama addressing the American public as he continues to talk about the fight of the Islamic State extremists and what the U.S. is doing. Joining me now live on set, Tim Starks from CQ Roll Call to give us a political perspective. But first, retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor of the Macgregor Group. You've seen these stories all the time in your line of work. How did the president lay out his plan, and did he hit a home run?
Well, I didn't hear a plan. What I heard the president do was commit the United States and the American people to an open-ended campaign of counterterrorism in the Middle East, ostensibly on the side of the Shiite Arabs in southern Iraq and the Kurds in northern Iraq, supposedly with a coalition which he did not enumerate or explain, and that we're going to do this until these organizations, ISIL, ISIS, whatever we're calling them, the Islamic State, disappears. That's a pretty tall order for air power, and it assumes that we're going to have the cooperation of lots of people, many of whom are actually backing the Islamic State.
Even once they're gone, once ISIS, the Islamic State, Levant, L for Levant, if we call it Levant, then Iraq becomes Mesopotamia, so whatever. Right. But once they're gone, they can morph into something else.
Of course. And remember, their recruiting stations and their cash support, their monetary support, their supplies, come out of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. I mean, these are the states that are supposedly going to be part of this coalition. We know from the Secretary of Defense's meeting with the Turkish General Staff a couple of days ago, they made it very clear that they would participate, but within very specific parameters. In other words, there would be conditions under which they might participate. I think he's dressed this thing up to the best of his ability to be a strategic plan, but in reality, he is doing something in response to the decapitation of 2 American journalists on television.
Their videos sold the American public for support. Tim Starks from Roll Call, we've got this overwhelming majority of Americans who support doing something against the Islamic State. ISIS handed it to us with those videos. It's one thing to say, like, hashtag save the girls and now go after ISIS. It's another thing to actually make that a reality. Now, this story just in, a U.S. official says Saudi Arabia has agreed to open its bases for the training of moderate Syrian rebels as part of an effort to better equip them against the threat of the Islamic State militants. Where's everybody on Capitol Hill? It's midterm election time. I don't see a lot of politicians coming out saying, yeah, this is what we should do, because they're afraid of blowback if it doesn't work.
And they've been somewhat afraid of this situation pretty much from the start of when things started degenerating in Syria. You know, when the president came to them and said, would you please vote on allowing airstrikes? That was part of his fear of getting overly involved. And you saw that the Hill, other than a few lawmakers who were pushing the issue, other than one committee that did something on that proposal, they wanted to avoid it then. They've warmed up to it a little bit because of what you said, because of the decapitations that moved the public to a certain degree, and that in turn moved Congress. If the polling has changed a little bit. The last time I was here, we talked about this very issue of how national security wasn't playing real big in these elections. Well, the polling has shifted, and people are more interested now in doing something, like you said. And that in turn has made it so that Congress has been a little bit more interested in doing something, to the point that when they were going to vote today on a possible resolution to keep funding the government, when Obama came to them with a late request to say, help me put in this $500 million to arm the Syrian rebels more than we've done so far, the Hill said, okay, we'll consider this. So I think there's a little bit of the two sides moving toward each other politically, and part of that is driven by the public wanting to do something more than we've been doing.
One of the headlines coming from tonight's address is the president said he would take this fight to Syria if need be. Here's what he said.
I can announce that America will lead a broad coalition to roll back this terrorist threat. Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense. Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq.
Doug Macgregor, you're a decorated combat veteran. He talked about the government dealing with and working with the government of Iraq. There is no government there. That's one of the problems. And does it surprise you, or is it just one of the necessary evils that we've got to go into Syria?
No, it's not surprising, but it's incredibly dangerous. First of all, he talked about going back to Congress and saying, listen, I want you to arm and train these Sunni Muslim Arabs who are moderates. Well, here's something interesting for your viewers. Some of the Sunni Muslim Arabs who were moderates that we trained and equipped in Jordan are now fighting with ISIS in Iraq. This business of these are the good ones, these are the bad ones, these are moderate, these are immoderate, these kinds of things don't mean much. This is a very complex region. Everyone has an agenda. Their agenda is not our agenda. And when the president starts talking about expanding into Syria, he's now approaching the Turkish border. The Turks have very real, vital strategic interests in what happens in Syria. They want the removal of Assad and the Shiites. They are part of this Sunni coalition. So this is very problematic to expand this thing as he's talking about it. Sure, we can hit targets on the ground, but people on the ground are going to take advantage of our airstrikes. They're going to use our airstrikes for their own purposes that don't necessarily align with ours.
The worry is one day they're fighting for us, the next day they're fighting against us. So Osama bin Laden, wasn't he on our side at one time?
Of course. We thought he was.
Freedom fighters against the evil Soviet Empire. It's ironic that this comes on the eve of the 9/11 anniversary. Here's what the president said about 9/11.
My fellow Americans, we live in a time of great change. Tomorrow marks 13 years since our country was attacked. Next week marks 6 years since our economy suffered its worst setback since the Great Depression. Yet, despite these shocks, through the pain we felt and the grueling work required to bounce back, America is better positioned today to seize the future than any other nation on earth.
Tim Starks from Roll Call. Observers are telling me it's important that the president mention the economy, mention how well we're doing, because Wall Street is watching this closely. We don't want the markets to tank. They very well could take the wrong turn tomorrow just after the fair. Otherwise, some analysts are saying defense stocks are going to go up. Raytheon, for example, others involved with munitions and radar, it's going to be better business for them. What do you expect to hear from Capitol Hill and Wall Street, for that matter, in the next few days?
So Capitol Hill was, I think, being a little cautious about not wanting to get ahead of the president here in case the politics shifted. Talking to members of Congress today, a number of them were saying things like, well, let's hear what he wants to do first before they were willing to commit to any particular kind of action, including even things they've kind of proposed before. So they were playing a wait-and-see game, I think, to see how this speech went and what happened with the public. And then, of course, as far as the stock question, that's an interesting one. I think it'll depend on how much of a sense Wall Street gets that this is going to be a prolonged, as the Colonel said, a potentially open-ended, long-lasting war.
For example, it took the downing of the Malaysian airliner to send Wall Street tumbling for a couple of percentage points for the year, for a couple of months anyway. The beheadings of Foley and Sotloff, that galvanized the country, galvanized the world, Doug. But beyond that, what else do we have to worry about from ISIS? For example, there's thought that some are saying they could use biological weapons. Others are concerned, bringing up the drama issue in Mexico, that they could be trying to get through the U.S.-Mexico border.
Well, listen, we've already got Muslim terrorist cells inside the United States, Shiite and Sunni, that have walked into this country from Mexico. They're already here. So the notion that ISIS is somehow or another going to create something new is just utterly false. We've already got those problems. We've got the FBI fully engaged in tracking and watching these people. So if you defend the border, you can stop a lot of it, absolutely. And it's a lot cheaper to defend your border than it is to launch airstrikes all over the Middle East. But then you get into the immigration question. Are you going to control it? Are you going to enforce federal law? We don't even do that. These are fairly inexpensive ways of dealing with terrorism. But to go back to your point about biological issues, Ebola is spreading very rapidly in Central Africa. One person who happens to have Ebola, who manages to get into the country legally, poses an infinitely greater threat to the United States than anything happening in the Middle East.
There's been the controversy about boots on the ground. Whose boots are they going to be on the ground? General John Allen talked about that. Let's listen to what he said.
I think we need a comprehensive approach. Some of that's going to be special operators on the ground. I don't think necessarily we need maneuver forces. There's lots of people whose interests are vested in a positive outcome here. We need to build a coalition that can support this.
Tim Starks, how willing is Congress going to be to sit back and watch the president build this coalition? I know there are going to be a lot of people second-guessing tomorrow. We've got France, we've got, not too sure about Turkey. What's the political fallout going to be going forward?
So the coalition is going to be hard to manage, and we wrote about that today, in fact, that these countries have the Sunni allegiances that make it so they might not want to get too overly involved in fighting in a way that would benefit Shiites. So that's a potential problem that is going to be happening with the coalition. I think Congress is staying away from that. What they're going to be doing are things like talking about the border. There was a hearing today where they were discussing legislation to try to figure out a way to deal with the no-fly list, to bolster it against these potential terrorists, to deal with the border and help there. The other thing, though, is that some of these, even at these hearings today, there was a discussion that maybe they're not still the number one threat. To the homeland, that in fact even al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still would be the number one threat that would be a potential strike within the homeland.
I appreciate getting your insight tonight. This has been a News Channel 8 special report. Thanks to our analyst, Tim Starks from CQ Roll Call, retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor of the Burke-Macgregor Group. I'm Morris Jones. Keep it here on News Channel 8. Toyota Sports Talk is next.